Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Today I'm going to be doing my flip through and review of the Pathfinder Gamemastery Guide. This is the latest release for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and this was a book that I've been very interested in since it was first announced near the sort of late 2019. So I'm going to be flipping through it first, just going to go through sort of all the chapters, show sort of what's included, and then I will give my thoughts at the end. So let's just go ahead and get right into it here. Of course, we have our table of contents, and one thing I will always say is I love like the artwork along the top there instead of just like the list of chapters. It's a little bit more visually appealing. So chapter 1 is introductory stuff. So this is primarily, I would say, aimed more towards beginners in terms of people that are just starting to get into the hobby. However, I think overall there's always some great information in here that I think just about anyone can really benefit from. So even if you are a veteran game master, this is something that I still think makes for a really great read. And there's all kinds of special information here, stuff like social encounters. We went past some information on mounted combat and aerial combat and stuff. So there's just a lot of great little bits of information here that, like I said, I think most people would be able to benefit from. And of course downtime stuff, which is also really nice to have some more information on. Just again, overall really great stuff. Resolving problems, so it even goes into information on how to deal with certain player types, how to do like storytelling things. Just some really great information, and for beginners, this is something that I think is really invaluable. But I'll get more to that sort of when I get into the review portion. So for now, we're just going to sort of flip through information on encounter design, time pressure. So trying to create encounters where there is sort of a ticking clock, which is I think can always be a lot of fun. Because it does put the pressure on the players to sort of try their best in terms of like tactics and things like that. Chapter 2 we're getting into is for tools. So this is something, things that you can use to help you when you're running your games. So the information that we have in here is there's information for creating creatures. So if you want to customize your own, create your own creature or sort of NPC stuff, then there's a lot of great information there. There's also information for building hazards, building items, so like magic items, item quirks, so some things that could make the item unique as it's being used. Intelligent items, cursed items, which is always, they can always be a lot of fun to use, provided you use them sparingly and not just constantly throw cursed items at your party. There's relics, artifacts, gems and art objects, afflictions, and then information for building worlds, nations, settlements, and planes. So again, just a lot of really great information here. I do want to actually do a separate video where I try to sort of just create my own creature, my own monster, and this gives you all of that information. So this is something that I will do a more in-depth look at, but for now it gives you a lot of really solid guidelines to use. Then we get our traits, and we move into hazards here. It also comes with a list of sample hazards like snowfall, treacherous scree, brown mold shriekers. So it gives you the information or some things to keep in mind when creating these, and gives you lots of examples, which is, again, the examples are almost more useful than the guidelines, because then you can sort of see how they're built. You follow the guidelines and sort of look at one of these hazards to see how they go. Then we have complex hazards, which generally have, well, obviously you can see much longer stat blocks to them, but generally they have more than sort of one thing that they do. There might be spell elements involved, or multiple damage types, or just certain ways that they can be triggered, versus the simple ones, which is sent to kind of like one type of effect, like the snowfall thing. The hazard could be exposure to the cold, but with the complex hazards, we're just going to go through and read through one of these. So we're going to look at Eternal Flame. So this is the first one that they give us as an example here. So it has a stealth bonus of plus 18. So that's sort of, you roll that, add that to see how well hidden it is, and that sets the DC basically for perception checks or other checks, thievery checks, or what you might need to make in order to spot them. So it says, description: a raging spectral inferno rises out of thin air, strengthening all undead creatures within its area. This haunt most often arises from the charred remains of a group of 3 people who were burned to death. It's pretty nasty. Whether in a terrible accident or deliberate execution, and their unavenged souls burn with rage. So to try to disable this is a DC 27 diplomacy check, so you actually interact socially with these spirits. It's not a mechanical trap in this situation. You can do that to temporarily calm the spirits, or a DC 30 religion check to exorcise one of the spirits, which means you'd actually have to make 3 of those checks in order to completely overcome the hazard. And it actually sort of reminds me, just that aspect of it, during the playtest, overcoming locks actually generally required more than one successful skill check to fully pick the lock, so it's kind of cool to see something like that there as well. And then Searing Agony, which is a reaction. Divine Mental are the traits to it. The trigger is a living creature approaches within 10 feet of the remains of the victim. The effect: memories of the pain suffered by the fire's past victim assault the targeting creature's mind. The creature must attempt a DC 25 will save, and the haunt rolls initiative. Critical success on the save, the creature's unaffected. If they succeed, they're sickened 1. If they fail, they're sickened 2. If they critically fail, they're sickened 3 and are flat-footed for as long as it remains within the area of the haunt, and for 3 rounds thereafter. And then it has a routine, which would be probably on its initiative, using the stealth to determine its initiative. 1 action, the phantom flames rage across the haunted area, dealing 46 fire damage to each living creature within the area. DC 23 basic will save to overcome it. And basic will saves are sort of what they're the most common types. So on a success, you take half of the damage. On a failure, you take the full damage. On a critical success, you take no damage. And on a critical failure, you take double damage. And then they gain the trait, undead creatures in the area are infused with flames for the following round. They gain the fire trait and immunity to fire, and all their attacks deal an additional 1d6 fire damage. Objects in the area unaffected. And then reset: the flames cease for 1 minute after all living creatures leave the area, but after 1 hour the anger and pain simmer up and the haunt is ready to trigger again. So that's just sort of an example of the more complex ones, and there's actually some really cool storytelling elements just to that one trap or hazard that I think would actually be really cool to have as the basis of an adventure, trying to exorcise the spirits. Then we get into information on building items. The item quirks, which again are just a list of different things you can apply to them. We'll just read the first one here. So the first quirk is melodic, which whenever you use the item, faint music plays when you're using it. So if it's like a weapon, for example, every time you swing, there might be like chimes that play. It's just, again, just nice little touches to use. Some guidelines for intelligent items. And then we get some, with examples, of course, because there's examples of everything that they have in here. Then we get into our cursed items. I gotta be honest, I love the monkey's paw, and I feel like trying to incorporate that into a game. Because it grants wishes, but you don't actually have to specify that you're wishing. When you're in possession of it, you can't get rid of it until you actually use up all 3 of the wishes. Even if you try to throw it away, it just appears back on your person again after, I think, like an hour. If someone steals it, it still comes back after an hour, and nobody else can use it until you finished it. But essentially, if you have this item, you're cursed with this item, and you say anything that could be construed as a wish, boy, it would be nice if, like that kind of statement sort of thing, then it can just automatically trigger the wish on its own. I think that's kind of fun. And of course, because it's a wish spell in a role-playing game, it will do it in the most harmful or most twisting of the words phrasing possible way to grant the wish. So these are really great items to have, to use, but don't overuse them. Don't fill your campaigns with just a trove of cursed items. But if you use them sparingly, they can be a lot of fun. And then you have item curses, so these are properties that you can apply to certain weapons. Then we have our relics. Actually got quite a few of those, and then I believe we go into artifacts after that. So yeah, we have artifacts. Of course, we have our deck of many things, one of my all-time favorite items in RPGs. Orb of Dragonkind, so there's some information on sort of what they are, and lots of really great examples. And then gems and art objects, and this is something that I think this is another great chart to have, because, I mean, honestly, very rarely, I would say, at least in my personal experiences, but very rarely do DMs, and I'm guilty of this myself, but very rarely will we spend a lot of time really explaining what the art objects are or what the gems are. It's sort of easy to default to things such as, you could just, there's 6 gems and you appraise them, and this is sort of the worth of them total. So like I said, I'm guilty of that, but having that chart will make things a lot easier, and be something that I would definitely plan on using to just, again, liven up the like the treasures that the players come across. And then we have curses, good old-fashioned curses, and again, things that can be a lot of fun if used sparingly. Let's just look at Sellsword's Folly. So this is a curse, it's a motion, it's a 9th level curse, so this is kind of a big one. Even the most experienced combat veteran becomes as reckless as a rookie when suffering from Sellsword's Folly. So the saving throw is a DC 26 will. The effect is the chaos of combat overwhelms you. Each time you roll initiative for a combat encounter, you must attempt a new saving throw against the curse. On a failure, you become confused for 1 round. This is an incapacitation effect. So, again, curses can be a lot of fun. And then we have our diseases. And there's actually a few, like, real-world diseases thrown in here, like bubonic plague, malaria, tuberculosis, scarlet fever. So it's kind of cool to see those, along with things like crimson ooze and blinding sickness. And yeah, so the way that diseases work is when you're afflicted with it, there's a period that you have before you make your saves. It's not necessarily daily. I want to say it's weekly. I haven't used any of them yet, but I do like the way that it works, because if you fail the save, you enter like one of the stages, and if you get to the final stage, a lot of times it can be really bad. It's similar to how poison works. But there's typically, poison usually only has 2 to 3 stages, which might deal damage or status effects, but they're never in of themselves typically lethal, unless you get to some of the worst ones. But some of these diseases can get really, really bad. So let's just take a look at blinding sickness, which is the one up here. So it says, endemic to jungles of the Mogwai Expanse, blinding sickness is transmitted by dirty water or the bites of certain creatures, so kind of like a mosquito or scourge type of thing as well. The saving throw is DC 23 Fortitude. It's a 7th level disease. So if you fail your first initial save against it and contract the disease, stage 1 is that you are a carrier with no effects. This lasts for 1 day. And then stage 2 is enfeebled 1. And that lasts for a day as well before you make your next save. So I guess it is daily. Stage 3 is enfeebled 2, which, again, that's for 1 full day. Stage 4 is enfeebled 2 and permanently blinded. Stage 5 is enfeebled 4, and then stage 5 is unconscious. Stage 6 is death. So you don't want to let diseases get out of the way. And then there's also drugs, which is something that I don't really plan on visiting in my game that I'm running. But there may be people out there that want to have access to that information, so it is something that could be useful for people to add into their games. And then we get into the building world section. And again, there's just a lot of great stuff in here. Building solar systems, nations. This is the one that I would probably use the most, would be nations and settlements. Although typically I use the pre-written stuff, the published stuff, so eventually, though, I do want to create my own setting, so that's when I'll really get into this. Then you have your different planes, your transitive planes, your material planes, outer planes. It just, again, sort of a little mini manual of the planes kind of thing. Gives you a little bit of information about them, what type of plane they are, what deities may exist there, what their inhabitants are, and a little bit of write-up on them. And then demi-planes, which you don't get a ton of information on, but it does give you a little bit of a blurb. And then chapter 3 is subsystems, and this is probably my favorite part of the book, and I'll touch again more on that when I get into the review. But here we have different systems that you can add to your game for different purposes. So there's victory points. The victory point says, provides you a framework with which to build your own subsystems, detailing the fundamental structure that Pathfinder uses for the subsystems. And then there's more fleshed out ones like influence, research, chases, infiltration, reputation, duels, so you can challenge someone to a duel, leadership, and exploration and vehicle information. So victory points in of themselves, I think, can be a lot of fun to work with. I've used them in the past when designing adventures that you have sort of like a mass combat situation going on, like where a city's being invaded, and the player character's actions can generate either victory points or you can lose victory points depending on how poorly they may do, and then you sort of set thresholds for different levels of success. So I've always loved that sort of system there. Infiltration is another one that I would absolutely love to use. Reputation is something that I also plan on introducing into my campaigns. Duels, so information for that. Leadership. Exploration, I think that's going to make a lot of people pretty happy. A lot of old school RPG players love good old-fashioned hex crawls, so it's great to have that there. And then some vehicle information, vehicles in combat, different types of vehicles like carts, carriages, gliders, rowboats. Variant rules. So the variant rules of the GIF here are ability score variants, alignment variants, deep backgrounds. So deep backgrounds replace simply selecting a background with a series of steps that flesh out the backstory. Feats and features, 0-level characters, magic item variants, proficiency without level, skill points, stamina. So that's some interesting stuff there. This is the chapter that I sort of looked through the least, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Although stamina looks like it was going to work exactly like the Starfinder version, where you sort of half your hit points that you get from your class would go into stamina. And the stamina points get used up first, and you just have to take sort of a short rest to get them back. You get resolve points that you have to use as well in order to get them back. It's essentially the Starfinder system thrown in here. And then we get a whole bunch of NPCs along with information on adjusting them for the different ancestries. So if you take just the generic NPCs here, but you want to make it a dwarf, elf, gnome, goblin, or halfling, then you can do that with the steps in here. And this gives you a ton of NPCs of various types. So we had some sort of the courtiers, like nobles, advisors, spies, palace guards, criminals, including the dreaded ruffian and the charlatan, burglar, fence, assassin, devotees. So you have your sort of religious things, including a zealot of Osmodeus, or Asmodeus, however you want to pronounce that. The downtrodden, with beggars and commoners, urchins and prisoners. Explorers, the torchbearer, which always used to be sort of an important NPC hire back in the earlier days of tabletop RPGs. So it's a really nice touch to see them brought back. Hiring guides, chroniclers to write down or to make notes of your travels. Good old-fashioned Tomb Raider. Foresters, so poachers, trackers, and hunters. Healers, apothecaries, physicians, surgeons, plague doctors, I like that one. Laborers, magistrates. Not mages, just magistrates. So, although some of them, do any of them have spells? Some of them, no, they don't. But they're sort of high-ranking individuals like harbor masters and stuff like that. Excuse me. And then you get into mercenaries, bodyguards, mage for hire, bounty hunter, monster hunter, and then mystics, including the false priest, which is one that I would probably like to use a lot, and cultist. Always great to have that stuff there. Necromancer, Cult Leader, Demonologist. And then we have officers, including like jailers, guards, watch officers, captain of the guard, just useful stuff that you may not plan to use, but players will often find a way. Performers, the dancer, acrobat, the troubadour, beast tamer. And publicans, so servers, barkeep, so these are sort of your service people. Scholars, seafarers, tradespeople, again, just tons of NPCs here. And then you get into some villains like Saboteur, Mastermind, Anti-Paladin is one that I would probably use. Reckless Scientist, I love the artwork for that. And then we just get into our glossary and index, and that is essentially it. We have our open gaming license and just an advertisement for the World Guide there. So, overall, what do I think of this book? I think that this is an absolutely fantastic, well done book with lots of really, really great information in there. Chapter 1 is, like I said before, it's very, friendly towards beginners, but it does sort of go over some things that I think are just useful for anyone to read through. For example, it talks about the hero points and trying to remind yourself to use them, and I am awful at that, so I will probably try to take some of the advice there to make sure that I'm not forgetting to use hero points, or not to use, but to award them, because that's something I'm really awful with. So I think that there's a lot of great information in there, but it is fantastic for beginners. And the thing about this book that I really like in terms of looking at it from the viewpoint of someone who's just getting into the hobby is it's far less of an intimidating book, just looking at like the thickness of it, when you compare it to the 600 plus page core rulebook. And I know sometimes with stuff like that it can be hard to figure out exactly where to start, or just can become overwhelming, because with 600 pages there is a ton of information to try to absorb. And I feel like this book, being a thinner book with a much more focused viewpoint on stuff specifically for game masters and to help people create and run their games, I think this is the least intimidating way to sort of get into getting comfortable with creating adventures and getting into the art of being a game master. So chapters 2 and 3 of this book, for me, is where it's all at. This is the section, these are the 2 chapters that I will be using the most out of this book, at least at this point in time. The tool sets for all the different options to create creatures, items, all of that sort of stuff is fantastic, and I can't wait to dive deeper into that, because I do like to create my own creatures on occasion. I do like to, create things like intelligent magic items, and having stuff like cursed items in there, which again, if used sparingly, can be a lot of fun. So it's great to have all that kind of stuff in there. Diseases, afflictions, other sort of things, all really useful tools to have, and they're presented really, really well here. I don't typically use a lot of hazards in my games. It's generally because I don't, right now in my Pathfinder game, I don't think anyone's actually playing a rogue, so but with this book now I might be a bit more inclined to at least throw in a few simple hazards of my own design in there. So I will say that just having that little section is tempting me to do something that I normally would just overlook if the party's not well equipped to deal with it. So that section I actually also really, really like. But for me, the subsystems is the ultimate part of this book that I just absolutely love. It's the part that I focused sort of the most on, just because it's stuff that I want to incorporate. I've used victory points in the past for like large-scale battles, and it works really great for that. But they've actually sort of taken that extra step and applied a victory point style system to other aspects of like an RPG that you may not necessarily always consider. For example, you could have like influence or reputation be required to gain or reach a certain level of, in order to make enough of an impression on an influential noble or someone of a high rank that you want to sway onto your side to help you. that you could have this now without it just being like, well, you make a single, persuasion check or a single, like, I guess diplomacy is the skill here. So instead of it just being like, well, you just make the roll, and if you succeed, you succeed. There's now a system where you kind of have to work a little bit more, and I like that aspect of it because you could use, the way that they interact, the skill checks that they do succeed on, you can grant them points, or if they fail or make fools of themselves, you can also take the points away. But another thing that I think might work really well, especially if you're doing a social interaction style adventure, or not even adventure, but scenario, is if the players just role play really, really well, and they, come up with great ideas of how to try to sway someone, and they phrase it in a really great way. Instead of letting them do all that and then have it come down to a die roll, you could just say, no, that was really well done. So here, assign the victory points to it. So I think that that's really, really great stuff. Infiltration is something else that I'd love to use. Or that I will love to use because, having the players have to sneak into an area and, their actions can, or inactions can start to sort of trigger alarms and raise general awareness and can make things a lot more difficult for them if they're not careful about how they proceed. And having that, again, sort of as a mechanical thing that you can sort of assign values to and work towards, I think is just going to be a lot of fun to use. And again, it sort of encourages you to try to incorporate that kind of scenario into one of your adventures, to have more social interaction, to have more at times where stealth might be the way to go. So there's just a lot of great stuff there. And reputation is something that I plan on incorporating, like, as of my next Pathfinder game. I'm running Age of Ashes, and the characters sort of have a base of operations in the town of Breach Hill. So they, are going to build reputation in that town, and now I have sort of a more fleshed out set of guidelines in order to do that with. So that's really, really awesome. The optional rules, which is chapter 4, there's a lot of cool stuff in there, but honestly, it's not something that I'm going to be using at this point in time. It's not that they're bad, it's not that they're poorly done. In fact, like I said, they look to be really, really well thought out and well written. The issue is that I'm just running so many different types of games right now that even the base rules can start to bleed together, and oftentimes these systems will just get confused in my head. Just because of how much stuff I'm running. So to take a game when I'm already running several different systems already and start throwing in stuff like the optional rules for things, it's just something that might add an extra level of confusion for myself personally. But if I narrow down the amount of stuff that I'm running and just sort of focus on the one or two systems that I'm really into, then I would be much more inclined. But that said, zero-level characters is something that I think would be a lot of fun to try out. So that's something that I might actually pursue. And then we have the NPC gallery, which there's just so many NPCs in there that a lot of them you may not necessarily think to have stats for. And a lot of like monster books, bestiaries, things along those lines probably won't want to spend too much space on. Things like, harbor masters or laborers or sailors or, the guards, captain of the guard, stuff that generally speaking you probably won't need, but players do have a way of forcing you sometimes to need to have those stats on hand. So there's just a lot of really, again, useful stat blocks there, and the guidelines for adapting them is really fantastic as well. So overall, I think that this is an absolutely fantastic book, and if you are someone who is running Pathfinder 2nd Edition, this is something that is going to help you out a lot. If you're someone who does homebrew specifically, there's so much tools and guidelines and things you can use to help you flesh out and build your worlds and populate them with creatures of your own design. There's just so much stuff for homebrewers in here that I would almost say this is sort of an essential pickup. For people running pre-written adventures or published adventures, which I kind of fall into at this point in time at least, it'd be a little bit more of a bit more work to incorporate some of those things in there. Like if you have sort of a social encounter in one of the published adventures, then you might want to try to incorporate influence or reputation into it, but it's something that it's not done from the beginning, so you have to work that in yourself. But even then, it's still something that I'm looking forward to. So I think there's a little bit of something for everyone here. And the fact that this is something that will be a little less intimidating to approach from the perspective of someone who's new to the game versus a well done, but at the same time, it's still a 600-page book, core rulebook. This is going to be a little bit easier to digest, and where it is focused on Game Master options and Game Master advice, this is something that I think beginners or people that aren't that are newer to running games, this is an absolutely fantastic buy. The retail price for this US is $49.99. And this is a book that I actually did pay for myself, and I paid Canadian dollars for it, which ended up being a bit more. But for me, even though its costs probably around $60, $65, it was still worth every penny, in my opinion. So I think there's a lot of great stuff in here for everyone, and I think anyone running Pathfinder 2nd Edition is going to find something in here that they're going to want to incorporate into their games. So that's, I guess, the highest praise that I can give it, is that it's just going to be, there's great stuff in here for everyone, novice and veteran alike. When it comes to running games, there's just so much great stuff in here that I cannot recommend enough. So let me know in the comments below if any of you have picked up the Game Mastery Guide at this point in time. What optional rules have you incorporated, if any? What subsystems and tools have you taken advantage of? Or how many of the NPCs have you used? Or what creatures did you create? Or what items or what hazards have you created yourself? I would love to know, because this is a book that, again, I'm really excited over, and just can't get enough of flipping through, and there's just so much great stuff in it. Like I said, I'm kind of, I don't want to start blabbering on too much about it, but let me know how you've been able to use it in your game so far, because I think it's just a fantastic product overall. So thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Take care.